Good morning, everyone. My name is Mehul Patel and I'm from GDG Nasik. Welcome to the second webinar of Google Cloud Next Extended Series, which is hosted by the GDG Rest from India. So, I would like to welcome our today's speaker, Saurabh Choraria, who is a Google developer expert for GD for G Suite. And to know more about him, you can just simply go and check out the event bio. And just don't forget, if you have any questions, feel free to drop in the comment box. We will definitely address them during the session or by end of the keynotes, right? And one more thing, don't forget to subscribe this channel, and because we really don't want you to miss any of our upcoming events, right? And by the way, you still have a time. You can simply copy this streaming link and send it to your tech buddies, your colleagues from the company, so and ask them to join right away. So without much ado, let's dive in. So over to Saurabh.
All right. Hey, everybody. Well, thanks, Mehul. Thanks for the cool introduction. Definitely helps. And for everybody else, so yeah, I actually do a lot of Google App Script related activities. So majorly, it's G Suite, which involves everything from Google Sheets to Docs, Slides, Data Studio, and so on and so forth. And well, of course, as Mehul said, you have some time if you want to share and have some other folks join in. Feel free to spread the word so that others could just quickly jump in on the live event. And of course, a huge thanks to the GDG West team. I think, as far as I know, I haven't known multiple different GDs coming together and sort of doing something. So kudos to them for actually arranging this. Most importantly, there's also Google Cloud OnAir that's happening right now. So in case you have missed any of the actual major information and releases about what's happening in the G Suite world, of course, feel free to just Google Google Cloud, OnAir sessions, and I think it'll land you there. But as for the session today, right? So let me also jump on to my presentation. I hope that's visible. My PPT is available right here. In case you're not able to see, of course, just comment it so that you can quickly get in an update. But I think it's available now. So the idea for this topic is actually just that, which is only with AppScript. So the main theme here is essentially there are a whole bunch of things in terms of automation, in terms of optimizing workflows that most developers can do using, let's say, if you want to automate something in Google Sheets, you can of course use API and also write the code in Python, PHP, JavaScript, anywhere, which is a lot more convenient and comfortable for you. However, the theme that I wanted to sort of share is there are a couple of things which you can only do using the Google App Script ecosystem. And of course, you would need to sort of know a little bit of low-code JavaScript, if you will, wherein you don't have to handle OAuth and things like that. We'll cover a few of these in our talk today. But that's the theme overall that I would be talking about. I'll try and make this quick and simple and short. It would of course not cover every single thing that we do using Google Apps Script or within the G Suite realm. So the idea or the agenda is essentially something like this. I will, of course, give an intro to Google Apps Script as to what Google Apps Script is all about, what are the things you can do with it, and I would quickly dive into the two core concepts that I want to cover. One is the G Suite add-ons, or rather, the editor add-ons and everything to do with Google add-ons, so to speak. And just a quick FYI, it is different from your Chrome extensions. So I've sometimes seen people get confused with Chrome extensions and add-ons, right? So these are two extremely different entities. This would not be a session about Chrome extensions. I think that is a web-related activity altogether. However, you would definitely get to know a whole bunch of things that you could do using add-ons. So that's one. The other thing, and I think the second thing might just be a little more cooler for a whole bunch of different people who are joining in on this session, that would be the Data Studio connectors, right? I will cover that. In case you do not know what Data Studio is, of course, take a second, Google what Data Studio is, so you can basically understand at least a little bit of it. But I would make sure to cover as to what Data Studio is, and also we can run down as to what connectors are in a little more detail, right? All right, so that's in terms of the agenda, and let me just quickly dive in and move on to just start with what is Google Apps Script. I am sure most of you would already know what that is. However, for somebody who's joining in new, I think it just makes sense to let me quickly take you through what exactly Google Apps Script is. The way, if I were to ever describe it, right? So it's basically of course it's a JavaScript based serverless low code platform. And most certainly the pie chart is a wrong graph to describe it. I just felt it's a lot more cooler with the whole animation thing, but I guess you get the picture that the reason why it's serverless is because it is hosted on Google's cloud, so you don't have to, let's just spawn an instance, create an instance on AWS or your GCP account at all. Everything is actually managed by Google directly. The reason why it is a low-code platform is because, let's say if you have to handle anything to do with OAuth, right? You're making an API request. Typically, if let's say you're using Python or PHP, you first have to address the whole issue of handling OAuth authentication. Then you also need to manage the scopes that you're requesting. What I mean by scope is, or rather in the Google ecosystem, scopes are essentially a way to essentially let the application know what are the kind of permissions you're asking for. For instance, are you asking the user to authorize a read access, or are you asking the user to authorize a write access to your Sheets, Drive, Docs, and so on and so forth, right? So you don't actually have to manage most of these things. I mean, you are free to do it if you want to. You do have the control of it. However, majority of it is automatically handled by AppScript directly when you're using their online IDE, right? So, which is what makes it a low-code platform, and of course JavaScript based, which is mostly, the Google AppScript community recently received a V8 upgrade from E5, ECMAScript 5. So right now we are on the V8 engine, so that's something pretty cool. But that's essentially what AppScript is, right? Now, actually, let's move on to see what can AppScripts be used at, right? I think one of the more cooler use cases, and I think I covered this in terms of how AppScript can be used as, is webhooks, which I think a majority of the folks in the dev community as well did not really know. People were like, okay, can you actually create a webhook using AppScripts, right? So I'm going to quickly cover as to what are the other things you can do using AppScripts, right? So first off, of course, you can use this as a standalone script. And I'll tell you why this is important, perhaps in the next slide as well. But what this essentially means is, of course, you can just go to your Chrome browser or any Safari browser, whichever browser you're on. You can just type script.new, and essentially it would, if you're logged in, automatically your Google account will spawn a new script instance, and you can start coding, or rather start creating your script right away without having to go to a particular Google Doc. Typically, the idea, or most folks get introduced to AppScripts using either Google Sheets or Google Docs or Slides or some other entity, right? So people have this perception that you can only use AppScripts by a particular Google editor, which is either a document, sheet, slides, font, something like that. That's not the case. You can actually just spawn your own instance. Just go to, like I said, script.new, and you can basically spawn your own script right away. The other thing, of course, is the container-bound script, which is what I think, which is how I think most folks get introduced to Google Apps Script. Let's say you're in a Google Sheet, you plan to do some kind of automation. You go to your tools, script editor, and basically just open up a new script from there. So that's essentially a container-bound script, and you are free to sort of create this using Google Sheets, Docs, Slides, and Forms as well. So these are the different places where you can actually spawn a new container-bound script. The other thing, of course, and this again, I don't think many people know this, but you can actually create an entire web app just by using Google Apps Script as well. So this is something that I have done. I built a URL shortener service using Google Apps Script. It's currently live and available. It's tmt.pw. I mean, the reason I took a PW was because the domain name was under $2, which is why it's that extension. But you can pretty much have any domain extension and post a full stack web application on Google Apps Script. You can actually make that happen, right? So you can use that as a web app as well. And one of the more cooler function is that you can basically create your own custom functions in Google Apps Script. And especially for Google Sheets, right? And this is, of course, a little too Google Sheets centric, but I think it's a good place to even do a whole bunch of branding activities. Now, the reason why this is important is think about it as, let's say if you are working in a SaaS-based company, and or you have an application or a tool which happens to have an API. Think of it as this way, like what if you can now do equals company name and then basically allow users to trigger the API request right from a spreadsheet, right? Of course, developers would not necessarily use this all the time, but I think every developer, or mostly most developers and product managers, build these kind of tools for business users or for other users to be easily able to consume, right? So I think this is another very important feature that you can actually use Google Apps Script for. You can practically create custom functions with whatever name that you want, with whichever API that you'd like to use. You're free to use that using custom functions, right? Of course, there is this whole concept of webhooks. You can actually create webhooks using Google Apps Script. The snapshot, I think I don't know if that's really visible, but what I'm doing is I run a Ghost blog. I run my blog on Ghost platform, right? And if any newsletter subscribers actually subscribe on my platform, what I have done is I've set up a webhook on Ghost, and it actually captures the email and puts it on a Google Sheet. So practically, I mean, there are a whole bunch of other use cases you can think of, but you can use Google Apps Script as webhooks as well. And I think, last but not least, of course, in terms of what you can do with app scripts is Google chatbots. You can do Telegram chatbots as well. Basically, since it allows you the ability to do webhooks, you can practically do any kind of a chatbot with whichever platform, whatever programming language you need, you're sort of free to do that. However, with AppScript, you get a native integration where you don't have to manage, let's say, doing webhooks, doing any kind of other polling activities when handling chatbots. You sort of have a kind of a direct integration where you can basically connect your AppScript project to the Google chatbot you're trying to host, and boom, you're good to go right from there on forward, right? And yeah, well, that's pretty much it. I mean, those are some of the things that you could do using AppScript by not just on the AppScript platform, but of course through some other programming languages as well. Should you love PHP, Python, something else, you can do all of that using some of that, at least using different languages as well. However, the idea or the core topics for this particular discussion or the talk would be on add-ons and Google Data Studio community connectors, right? So this is something that you can also do using Google Apps Script, and let me just dive in on these topics. So in case you don't already know what are add-ons, again, please Google it. Take a second, take a moment to just Google what add-ons are, and you can essentially see what comes up. I think ideally you would land on a G Suite marketplace kind of a web page. However, you can think of add-ons as a way to sort of extend your G Suite ecosystem, right? And what I mean by G Suite ecosystem is essentially think of your Gmail, and if any of you work in a company that uses G Suite, think of that as well as a particular part of the ecosystem, right? So you have your Gmail, you have your Google Sheet, you have your Google Docs, Slides, Forms, Calendar, Drive, etc. Think of any of these entities and imagine a way where you can extend it. And what I mean by extend is, again, the use cases are plenty, right? The quickest example that comes to my mind is, if at all, let's say your support team, the company that you work for, or let's say if you're running your own business, right? And your support team is handling emails using Gmail. Now, an ideal way to do that is, or rather typically what happens is people get an email, then somebody looks up that email in your internal database or internal CRM to understand who this particular customer or the user is, and then figure out their details, then come back to your Gmail and then type a response, right? But think of a way wherein, what if within the Gmail ecosystem or within the Gmail web page on your browser, what if there was an extension where, as soon as you get an email from somebody, the add-on essentially picks up that email, queries your internal API, gets the data, and displays those results, right? What if that were a possibility? And you can think about a whole bunch of similar use cases, scenarios, and problem statements that extends to Google Sheets, which I would assume is one of the more commonly used things in the whole, G Suite ecosystem in some sense, right? You may, of course, use docs and slides as much as well. But in my experience and understanding, most people end up using Google Sheets a lot more. And there are a ton more of add-ons that you can build from there on forward, right? So that's a general idea of what add-ons are. And so some of these are, of course, at this point in time, it is sort of divided into the G Suite add-ons, and then there are something called as your editor add-ons. I'll show that in the next slide. But your G Suite add-ons right now are, your Gmail, Calendar, and Drive. I think Google recently just announced, well, when I say recently, just about in the last 3 or 4 days during the on-air sessions, our developer advocates actually just announced that they intend to incorporate every other, let's say, tool, your Google Sheets, Docs, Slides, Forms, etc., within the G Suite add-on ecosystem itself. But right now, it's sort of divided into your G Suite add-ons and then your editor add-ons. So editor, of course, is your Sheets, Docs, Slides, and Forms, and then your G Suite add-ons, right? So it is divided. It might get a little confusing for some, maybe not all. However, think of them as just add-ons. However, some parts of it, some ways of, let's say, handling some of these scenarios, either in terms of authorization or in terms of the triggers that you can currently keep, or the review process, are slightly bit different when it comes to G Suite add-ons versus editor add-ons. However, they still do the same job of being able to extend your existing G Suite ecosystem to perhaps something more, something beyond just within Google services, right? You can also call third-party APIs should you choose to do that, but that's what they do. Currently, of course, like I said, it's divided between G Suite and editor. We will try and cover some of these things in this particular talk. However, of course, there is a lot more to it than just what we would cover right now. But now looking at this, now these are some of the snapshots that I thought might just help. So this is a snapshot wherein you can see it's a Google Doc, and the sort of add-on shows up to us the right. You can have add-ons in a whole bunch of different ways. It can be a menu item, it can be a sidebar, it can be something else altogether as well. But essentially, that's what these things would look like. This is the one on calendar. Let's say you have a to-do list. Well, this is a use case in which you have a whole bunch of tasks that are aligned on your calendar, and you also have a to-do list sort of showing up towards the right. That's again just an example, of course, and the contacts add-on on the Gmail side of things, right? But of course, these are just mock-ups of the ideas. However, like I said, you're free to come up with your own problem statements. Talk to the folks who work, in different teams and understand if they have any particular need along these lines, and perhaps then come up with the right solution for a whole bunch of these scenarios, right? And this is something which I think is mostly for folks who are thinking about also building a product, right, or trying to think of a way. Okay, how do I now start to make some money, or if I want to launch my own, either side project or a startup or whatever, right? I would definitely encourage people to think of building an add-on as equal to building a product, right? You create an add-on. There are a whole bunch of nuances that you need to be very mindful of when creating an add-on, and I think those are a lot of those are the similar nuances you stumble upon when you're even building a product, right? So this is something which I want to really stress on again. But of course, different people would have different opinion. However, this is what mine is, that creating an add-on is literally equal to building a product. So the way I see it is, let's say, the user persona, right? And this here is, I would say, a little bit of a product jargon. I don't think developers really talk about things in these ways, but I mean, some developers do. So the user persona here would resemble a way for a developer to identify and understand as to who the user is. Is this person an editor, or is this person is a viewer, commenter, and admin, and so on and so forth? Because you would, unless you know who you're building an add-on for, it becomes very difficult to sort of understand the authorization lifecycle, right? So it is super important that you identify who the user is that you're building for. Is it for an admin of a G Suite account? Is it for only people who have edit access, or even for people who have comment access? And conversely, what would happen to your add-on if it is given to somebody who only has view access, comment access, and so on and so forth, right? So the whole authorization lifecycle, as well as the who the user is sort of covered under the user persona side of things. That is again very important. Very recently, the G Suite team released a Figma collection where they actually focus immensely on the design side of it. to how a G Suite is supposed to be designed. And I would also encourage folks to not just think of this as animations or colors or shapes, but it is also a lot more of user experience. And this connects back to the way you handle authorization, right? You wouldn't want to have a terrible experience while somebody's using your add-on, which is why it is very important you also think about the design aspects of your add-on. Like, for instance, if at all somebody just installed your add-on, what is the message that they're supposed to see? Are they supposed to authorize once they have added something, and so on and so forth? Are they supposed to pay for that add-on somewhere else, perhaps on an external site? Are they supposed to be redirected? Are you supposed to open a new URL, and so on and so forth, right? And that's external activity. Even internally, there are, of course, a certain restrictions as well as to the way that you can design, right? For instance, you can't take total control over somebody's Gmail account remotely and then be then hold that user a hostage or something like that. Right? You cannot design your add-on in that way, which is again another reason why there are certain restrictions on a way that you can actually design your add-on as well. So I would say this is again a very core component. There are certain resources available. There are a whole bunch of folks who have actually built add-ons as part of their everyday life and everyday job. So you can, of course, read through some of those resources a little, but the idea here that I want to impress is it is very important that you know who you're designing it for and what you're designing as well, mostly, right? And then, of course, there's the whole development process. And I think I'm going to keep this one short. The simplest way I can actually express this is, well, you're supposed to code the whole add-on, of course, from either from a scratch, or you can use the open source code. The couple of things that comes very deeply on the development phases of it is the testing part of it, because you'll be surprised, no matter how much of exception handling you've done, or let's say you are calling an API and you have set up the API to respond with a 500 saying, okay, something went wrong, or perhaps a 404 saying something not found or something like that. You'll be surprised as to the kind of errors you may actually end up facing when the add-on actually goes live, right? So it is very important in the development phase. So first is the error and exception handling. I'm sure most developers know the differences between the exception and the error handling side of things. So it is super important you do that even while building add-ons, along with the whole chunk of testing that goes in, right? You are the only person who will be doing the QA. Right? Otherwise, the best thing you can do is once you have developed an add-on, either if it's a proprietary add-on or if it is something that only folks within your org can use it, you can actually define who has access to these add-ons, share it with the folks first before you actually publish it even internally or to the world overall, right? Share it with folks, get some feedback in terms of whether they're able to access it, what are the challenges that they face, what kind of errors did they stumble upon, if there are any, and so on and so forth. And that's what's covered in the development phases of, right? And the review, and this is not the review. This is not a code review. So this is not somebody, your own peer, doing a code review for add-ons. This is a review that happens when you actually submit your add-on to the G Suite marketplace. This is done by folks at Google, which is to say they then see what kind of OAuth scopes you have requested. Are you requesting any kind of restricted scopes, for instance? Are you trying to read and send emails as somebody else, right? Is your add-on trying to send an email as that particular user, who's actually installing that add-on, right? So those are super sensitive, restrictive scopes. Are you trying to access confidential data? And I'm not saying you can't do that, but those become some of your very restrictive scopes, right? So it needs a really good justification as to why is it that you're asking for a whole bunch of these permissions. And I'm not going to lie, this does get a little frustrating for a whole bunch of folks for a whole bunch of different reasons. Sometimes there is a confusion between the person who's requesting, which is, let's say, the developer or the user of the add-on, and the folks at Google who of course, just to be safe, reject your application at first, and then they ask you for a whole bunch of questions indicating why is it that you're trying to ask these, what is it that you need it for, what will you do with this information, how will you store it, and so on and so forth, right? So they try and probe and get as much understanding that they can along these lines. So you need to be prepared, I would say, as to if you're trying to ask for any restricted scopes, just be prepared to justify as to why is it that you're asking. And worst case scenario, you don't get approved for it. Also be prepared to provide alternatives, right? Let's say if you cannot get an entire read-write access, what is it that you can do best just with the read access of things, right? How can you otherwise restrict what your add-on can actually end up doing, right? So this is, however, nonetheless, a very important part of the process where it actually goes in a review phase. You might have to wait 2-3 days, depending on the complexity. The conversation may drag on for weeks, if not, for days. So that's a process. That's a part of the process. And I think finally, once you're through, once let's say your add-on is approved, it is also equally important that you try and maintain it, because there are a constant updates. Well, I wouldn't really call it constant. However, there are kind of updates that keep happening. And I think for the most part, most developers understand this. Like, you have new SQL versions coming up, new PHP versions coming up, new JavaScript, and yada, yada, yada. The same thing applies with even the AppScript ecosystem, which is another reason I would like to highlight the fact that this is as equal to building a product, because these are, I would say, a lot of these things are very similar to what you would do when actually building a product, right? So nonetheless, make sure you have, let's say, either test cases available, test functions available that allow you to do maintenance activities and maintenance tests while in the building process itself. That should help, right? Well, those majorly are, those are mainly the things that you end up doing while building add-ons. Since I'm going to switch to a whole different topic of Google Data Studio, I am actually, I would like to open up and open up this forum to just check in and see if any other folks have questions on building add-ons. Perhaps please comment it out on the place, I think on the channels. Okay, I think we have one to Google to build Google Apps Script. Do we require G Suite Premium? No, that's a very good question, and my bad, I did not cover it. I'm so sorry for that. You do not need G Suite Premium at all. All you need is a Gmail account, and that is it. This is from Sanjay. Thanks a lot, Sanjay, from the question. I hope I answered your question, but and this is definitely my bad. I should have covered this. In fact, everything that we have done so far, like it's completely free of cost. You can sort of set all of these things up free of cost. You do not necessarily need to have a G Suite account. You can do all of this using your Gmail account as well. Anybody else have any questions? I'm gonna wait for maybe like 20-30 more seconds, and then I'm gonna move on. But in the meantime, yeah, feel free to just type in your comments, and we can take some questions. I think well, add-ons is something it's not as I would say alluring, but I think Data Studio connectors might just be. But for folks who do plan on building add-ons, I would definitely urge you, you can venture into this. Also, very recently, and this is just something that's happening recently in the OnAir session, it was just disclosed that they also intend to have alternate runtimes. So I'm guessing what that would mean is essentially you can use your own language in the backend, right? You can host an HTTP endpoint and essentially have Google Apps Script push, or rather, request information on that endpoint, and you can have your own backend either in Python, PHP, JavaScript, or whatever, and return the response based on the language of your choice. I think they are planning to launch it quite soon. I don't think it's live at this point in time, which is why I did not really cover it as part of a slide. But there are plans to bring in alternate runtime, so you don't have to just do that using AppScript itself. All right, so I'm thinking there are no more comments or questions. So I'm gonna move on. Right, these are some of the follow recommendations. I would definitely encourage you check out Roman Wildard, who also happens to be running a whole bunch of add-ons already, which is live on the marketplace. His add-ons go beyond millions of users. I think 9 or 10 plus million in just a single add-on. So this is a person I would highly recommend you go through this person's profile and check out some of their work. Also, Alice Keeler, Now, Alice has mostly been doing a whole bunch of activities in the education space, which, by the way, is again a huge market. It's a huge ecosystem. Google for Edu is one of those things that a lot of educators are trying to build, bring in these automation and optimizations in their everyday workflow by using add-ons. So you should definitely check these folks out and their work on add-ons specifically, if at all you need some more ideas. Okay, what can I do? What are other people doing, and so on and so forth. So that's my follow recommendations for sure. And those are their Twitter handles, by the way, just FYI. Right. All right. So let me move on to the Data Studio community connectors side of things. And for those of you who don't know, I'm guessing most of you do, but just in case if you do not know, please do Google it out, open up and see what it is. It's a way where you can connect, visualize, and essentially share data, right? And the core platform was actually built to do charts and reporting and graphs for a whole bunch of other let's say connected data sources. You have your Google Sheet, you can connect your Google Sheet to Data Studio and visualize. Essentially, that was the whole idea. That is the whole idea for the platform. You can build very cool charts and graphs and a whole bunch of other controls within a dashboard-like interface that you can then share either outside your organization or just within your organization. Well, sharing is exactly the same as how, let's say, a Google Sheet gets shared or a Google Docs gets shared. It's the same process for sharing Data Studio. There are a couple nuances when you think of it, because let's say if you are building a Data Studio dashboard and you're sharing the visualization, the question may be what or who gets access to the underlying data, right? Because ultimately it is querying a existing database or a Google Sheet somewhere. However, you want to restrict as to what is actually being visualized. All of that is something that you can do with Share. Visualization allows you to do a whole bunch of different graphs and charts. You can also create your own custom visualizations where, let's say you are not happy with a bar chart and a pie chart, but you want a very cool looking heat map, right? And you can code this out, you can actually create it, you can publish it to the marketplace, and essentially you can use your own custom visualization should you choose to do that. However, in this conversation, in this talk, I'm going to focus on the connect part of it, which is where the whole connectors come in, right? A quick distinction before we dive in to the connectors aspect directly. So this is how I would classify, or rather, this is how connectors are classified at this point in time. You have something called as the native connectors. Now, native connectors are something that Google has given it out themselves, which is essentially, let's say, if you want to connect your Google Sheets data to Google Data Studio, you can do that with a click of a button. Same goes for, let's say, Google BigQuery. Same goes for, I think, a whole bunch of different, there are like, I think, 24 different data sources that you can connect. Like, I think YouTube Analytics is part of it, which Google has built it themselves. So those are, I would say, some of the native connectors that's available that you can use, right? And then comes the community connectors, which is what which would be the focus of this particular conversation, right? And even in community connectors, you have something called as partner supported and open source. Of course, I think you get the distinction of the open source, which is basically you create the connector, you essentially have to submit that entire code to a GitHub repository, which is managed by Google developers, especially specifically from the Data Studio ecosystem. They sort of then publish it out on the open source community. And then there is partner supported, which I would say is a way you can build your own business, right? There are companies who create partner supported connectors for Data Studio using Google Apps Script. So you can essentially charge people to use your connector should you want to do that, and so on and so forth. And that is something which is partner supported. And another quick distinction here is partner supported connectors are something that you maintain yourself and perhaps do not allow the rest of the world access to the core code as to how you end up building the connector, right? Of course. So I know open source is completely opposite of it. You write the connector, you share it with everybody, and it's open and available for everybody else. So that's the different types of things in connectors. Now, the part which I think not everybody is as familiar with and comfortable with understanding is how do you actually end up building a Data Studio connector, right? So it has some very core key required mandatory components. Well, those are too many objectives there, but these are some of the more necessary components that you need to sort of understand and know and code in order to build a data studio connector. The first one would always, of course, be the authentication type. How are you authorizing access to the data, right? Either you have an open API, right? So let's say you have an API that basically spits out data every time you query that. You make a get request or a post request or some other HTTP request, and essentially it returns the data in a JSON format or CSV, whichever is something that the API does, right? And the auth type might be none, which is to say it's an open API. Anybody can query it and get the data and then sort of visualize it. Or you may be authorizing it using a username and a password, the bearer token or a basic token, for instance. That might be the case. Or you might be authorizing it using a key, an API key, so to speak. So you can actually have that as an option. And perhaps not the last, but something I'm not so comfortable with is the OAuth way of doing authorization. And when I say I'm not comfortable, I do not really know how to code 100% accurately, handling the OAuth activities. But then that's also an option that you can have. Maybe you're trying to connect, let's say, your QuickBooks data to a data studio, and you're trying to build a connector for that. QuickBooks is a system that actually uses OAuth for the API request. So anytime somebody clicks yes, allow access, a pop-up would show up. It will be asked for the user to log into their QuickBooks account. They authorize the access, and then accordingly, the whole thing moves on from there forward. So the core or the first thing that, and it's a function, by the way, the reason I've added those brackets are not for styling purposes. The idea here is to explicitly mention that these are the functions that are needed as a mandatory requirement to be able to build Data Studio community connectors, right? So you need to be able to understand as to what authentication type that would be. Then comes the config, right? Think of the config as well, exactly just that, as to let's say you're trying to get somebody, you're trying to connect a database which has data from multiple different countries. Then you can actually ask as part of config, which there's a drop down available, or perhaps some other, it's a string or a text value that somebody can enter, and it's essentially a way to allow users to input custom configuration. What if they had to specify something which was very core to the kind of data that they need? That is what the get config function would end up doing. It will ask the user to give the input so that they can the API or the connector could query the right kind of data. That's the idea with the whole get config function. So soon after that, again, you get the schema. Well, I would say the schema is essentially just a simple grid structure of the data. Think of this as a SQL way of basically trying to get the data in a two-dimensional array, if you will, right? So you will have a row of data. You have the headers already available. Then you have the row of data one after the other, which comes only after you query. However, the schema part of it, or the schema function, allows you to generate this dynamically in a way where you can specify, okay, it is required to have a date column, it is required to have a number column, a Boolean true false, a string, and so on and so forth, right? So you can actually specify the schema, and you can actually, and you need to call it, well, it's not an optional one. You need to be able to call this function and get the schema of that particular data of the API source. So that's, again, a very important construct there. And finally, I would say the last thing that you do once you're able to get past through the authentication or the auth type, then the config, and then the schema, is essentially finally just get data, right? Where the user may actually have controls. Let's say that the simplest example of a control is your date control or the date filter, right? Typically, most data APIs allow you to query data using a date parameter, like from date to to date, or start date and end date, and so on and so forth. So a get data essentially is a function. As soon as you get that input from the user, okay, get me the data from this date to that date for these filters based on the config that I just specified in a particular schema format, right? Get data is a function which essentially queries the API, does the pagination should there be a need, and all of this is something you would have to handle using JavaScript itself within the AppScript ecosystem, where you paginate should you need to, keep appending the array with all the data items that you have at this point in time, and so on and so forth. and essentially just return the data back to the Data Studio Community Connector so that it can visualize it. But these, I would say, are the 4 core components on actually building a Data Studio connector, right? And of course, even this, if you're building an open source Data Studio connector, you practically do not have to like submit for a review or anything like that. But if you're doing one for a partner one, you again have to like essentially send your partner connector for a review, so folks at Google can actually see, check out your connector, and then essentially allow you to publish it on the Data Studio Marketplace. But these are some of the core components of building Data Studio connectors. If there are any questions on these, I'd be happy to take them at this point in time. Just let's say specifically about Data Studio as well, I think that will help. But yeah, I'm going to wait for maybe, yeah. So we have a question from you. Does G Suite support Data Studio as part of its services? Well, I'm not 100% sure if I understand this, but I would go ahead and say the answer is yes. I would also go ahead and say it is not necessarily a part of G Suite ecosystem, right? Technically, Data Studio is its independent entity. It was built as part of their marketing stack. Let's say if you wanted to connect Google Analytics data or Google Search Console data, I think if I remember this right, Google Data Studio was built as part of the marketing 360 something, and basically that's what it was part of originally. The connection with G Suite only comes in with like either the ability to code a connector using Google Apps Script, or let's say connect your G Suite Google Sheets data into, let's say, your Google Data Studio. But ultimately, you still can connect, let's say, the services that you have in G Suite to your Data Studio as well. I mean, it is definitely possible if that's what you mean by support. But it was a good question nonetheless. Can we use the IAM policy for auth request? Well, not really. I would say I'm assuming by IAM policies, I'm guessing you are referring to the G Suite side of the IAM, where even in G Suite accounts, you can actually specify what kind of access a person has. That's my assumption. If it's not, please feel free to clarify that in the follow-up comments. But not necessarily, I would say, because again, G Suite would be an entirely different entity versus what you have in Data Studio. You can manage a whole bunch of authentication and authorization within Data Studio itself. So anytime you basically create the visualization, and the reason for auth request only sort of kicks in once you have built the visualization within Data Studio. Once you have done that, then while sharing, you can specify would the person who you're sharing this to only gets access to the visual stuff or even the underlying data. That you can do, and it's from the UI. As far as I know, you cannot programmatically control it. It's from the UI where you can specify what kind of permission do people get to this particular data. Can the users that you share it to actually modify the underlying data, or rather, sorry, modify the underlying data that is creating the visualization, or they can only play around with the visualization side of Data Studio. So I don't know if that answers, but that's essentially the explanation to it. Let's see if there are anything else. Which types of data can be retained using G Suite Vault? Okay, that's a very interesting core specific question. That's from Sanjay. Sanjay, unfortunately, I have very little experience with working on the G Suite Vault. So I do not know what's available and what's accessible. However, this is what I would assume just by understanding the way Data Studio works, right? And let's say if you have the permissions, like when you're authorizing it, since I'm guessing you're talking about G Suite and Data Studio, this will be an OAuth request, or rather the OAuth authentication methodology, right? So your OAuth will automatically then determine whether or not you have access as a G Suite user to access like different components of the G Suite Vault. However, this is just intuitively I can respond because I have very little experience working on G Suite Vault specifically. I'm sorry about that. We can catch up offline for sure. I would love to experiment and then see what happens and what comes out of G Suite Vault. But that's a really good question nonetheless. I'm going to make a note of it. Yeah. All right, nice, pretty cool questions. OR2, does it OpenID connect? OR2, yes, that's correct. It's OR 2.0. It's from Gut2. The question is whether it is OR 2.0 version or does it use OpenID connect? It is OR 2.0 for sure. OpenID connect, as far as I know, it isn't, but I am not 100% sure whether or not Data Studio allows that. We should be able to look up the documentation. I had this open just in case if somebody asks for these questions. Please do not take the comment away, but we can actually look at it together. Let's see if at all authentication and authorization, right? So these are the things. Get auth type. So all right. So here you go. You have OAuth2. You have user password, the user token key, and then none. So looking at the documentation, Gatu, I don't think OpenID Connect is supported. However, I am sure there should be some way to sort of make that happen. I don't know the answer, but that's what the documentation says. Thanks. It's a really good question, though. Or let's keep more questions coming in. Just like Power BI has a Q&A API to allow interaction using NLP and returns an image of the graph or plot, can you provide some insights around any such API? Well, I see the NLP returns an image of the graph. Well, I don't think Data Studio allows you to get an image of the graph. Not as far as I've ever experienced it. You can create a whole bunch of other kind of graphs. You can build your own custom visualizations, if you will, right? I haven't really experienced and experimented much. I'm sorry, with custom visualizations, but there are ways in which you can actually create it. As for the Power BI's Q&A API, again, unfortunately, I have very little experience, in fact, no experience using the Q&A API of Power BI. So I'm not 100% sure if the functionality that Power BI provides is something that Data Studio can do with this specific use case. I don't think I have the answer on this one. I'm again sorry for that. All right, let's see if there are more questions on this. This is nice. This is something that even I should be Googling. Perhaps I haven't been creative with my approach on the things that you can do with Data Studio. But that's something I think I would love to do. For folks who just answer or ask these questions on the comments, let's please connect. You can find me on Twitter. You can send me an email. It's code@script.gs. It's my blog, and it's just code at something. You can, right? So we can connect on LinkedIn or Twitter, but definitely let's research together if that's an option. But yeah, those are very nice questions. Let me just wait for maybe 30 more seconds to see if there are more questions that people may have. But folks, these are really nice questions, and if you don't have a good question right away right now, don't worry about it. We can always connect. You can reach out to me in a whole bunch of different places, and we can talk about what kind of studio connectors, or if you have any specific question. I'm sorry, on this. But the idea here is if you're working for a company that actually has an API which gives data as part of its response, right? Which gives stats or data for if you're working for a company that provides mass mailing services or telecommunication services or anything else, and it requires your users to have access to stats, the best way to deliver them, of course, is via API. And if there is an API, build a Data Studio connector and then just essentially ask your users to perhaps try using it and see what kind of results come out of it. I mean, that's the easiest go-to. However, if you're ever in doubt as to, okay, how do I get inspired? What kind of Data Studio connectors can I actually build? The Data Studio team has done an amazing job of actually curating a whole bunch of different connectors that people perhaps have asked at some point in time. So you can go to the documentation, left bottom corner, you have advanced connector search. You can just see as to what the developer interests are and what the user interests are. So you can see either they're low, moderate, there are some high which are not available. And here it says whether the connectors are available or not. These are some of the companies who have, I would say, in some way have a monopoly in terms of building these Data Studio connectors. However, it is not restricted to a company. Any developer who understands a little bit of JavaScript and has some love for Data Studio can actually do this very easily. So this is an advanced, lengthy list well, you can see the way I'm scrolling, it's a super lengthy list. So you can always get some inspiration by the documentation as well. Okay, so looks like those are some of the questions that we have. The follow recommendation on this would be Minaz Kazi. He's one of the folks from the from Google Data Studio team. He's a DevRel, if I'm not mistaken. You can also reach out to him if you have specific questions. There were some amazing questions today. Unfortunately, I am neither qualified nor experienced enough to answer those, but those are very good questions, which I think you can also direct to him. And I think bunch of folks on the community side of community side of things, and people will be able to answer. You should definitely check his work out. There are a whole bunch of videos Minaz has actually created that actually takes you through the step-by-step of, let's say, building a Data Studio connector, building a whole bunch of, let's say, a partner connector, and so on and so forth. But yeah, definitely check him out as well. Besides that, well, that actually brings me to my closing notes, right? And I don't want to close by any abstract notions. I'm just gonna go ahead and share some real talk with you folks. The real talk here is there are these two core constructs where you might get stuck. I mean, not necessarily every time, but if you're building something really big, really huge, really complex, there are chances that you might get a little stuck, let's say, in terms of OAuth verification. Now, I'm guessing not everyone here would have had experience with working with AppScript as extensively. However, if you have, let's say, built an add-on before, or have built a Data Studio connector, or perhaps something else, you're always stymied with, you know, a message showing up saying, are you sure you want to authorize this application? It has not been verified by Google. There's an alert message which comes up with a red exclamation point, etc., which, you know, shoos away people from actually using your application. Which is why you need to take your application either, and this applies to both add-ons and Data Studio connectors, is that you need to have your you know, application have an OAuth verified in some sense, which is basically reach out to Google, tell them this is the GCP project. This is an entire documented process. You don't have to worry about actually typing this in an email. There's an entire process from the GCP Google Cloud you know, console that you can actually go through, where you need to basically you know, submit your app for OAuth verification. You would have to specify the scopes that you have requested in that particular application's use, and so on and so forth. So definitely be very mindful of during this process. You also need to submit a whole bunch of, let's say, icons, the logo that shows up, the privacy policy page, and so on and so forth. So those are, I would say, some of the housekeeping activities, but not necessarily housekeeping. Just from a developer point of view, I would assume that's housekeeping activities, but you still have to have, let's say, a privacy policy page explaining what happens with OAuth, how do you handle the user data, you know, and so on, and how do you handle access tokens, and so on and so forth. So it is super important that you have all of those things in place while applying or while submitting your application for OAuth verification. It can get frustrating. Don't lose hope. Do not give up. Reach out to the community if you are ever stuck. There are people from Google who are very active either on Twitter, Reddit, Stack Overflow, and a whole bunch of other places. Feel free to ask them questions. There are a whole bunch of other community members available on these topics. Feel free to ask them. And of course, the review process, which we spoke about. So one is the OAuth, which is separate from your actual review of an add-on or a Data Studio partner connector, if you will. So even that, at times, it's a lot similar to OAuth verification. However, during the review, people ask for even more details, and more than that, they also review the design of your add-on. For example, they check out the logo, they check out like a whole bunch of other things during the review process. So I would say, again, those are, which is why it is good to have somebody working with. If you're all alone, of course, reach out to somebody in the community. But if you happen to have somebody who is not a techie, right, like this guy, who's not a techie, you can reach out to them, ask for their assistance. Perhaps they can help you build the logo. Perhaps they can help you with documentation, or they can help you set up a privacy policy page, a particular blog, if you will, and so on and so forth. And those are, I mean, those are my closing notes for whoever plans to build either an add-on or a Data Studio connector, to be very mindful of these two constructs. But yeah, those were my closing notes. Now I think we are only left with like 6 minutes, but I'm gonna keep this open. Should somebody have any questions, anything they want to ask, either with add-ons, Data Studio, or perhaps AppScript in general. Anything and everything goes. You don't have to feel shy about either one thing or the other. So yeah, I'm gonna wait for like 30 more seconds before I perhaps hand the session over to Mehul once again. But in the meantime, if you have any questions, feel free to type them in your comment box, and I'd be happy to answer them. Let's see. I do hope you folks are having this was a productive session, and hopefully you guys you folks reach out to me or folks in the community and ask them for assist should there be a need. But yeah, looks like we are good, Mehul. Well, thanks again, Mehul, for the opportunity as well as for the GDG West team. In case you have anything you want to ask me or talk to me about, I am game. But otherwise, otherwise I am good. I loved being able to host the session. So this is fun. Thanks for the opportunity.
To be very honest, Saurabh, like I got to know so many things about the Data Studio and AppScript. Okay, to be fair, I know how to work on because that's not my domain at all. But somewhere or another, I used to use the G Suite a lot, right? But
right,
I've never found that there are little bit tricks over there that you should simply go and play with that. But
yes, very much.
got some very amazing questions again, and I can see that so many people will go dig you for that after the session. Right?
I hope so. I hope so. This is interesting. These questions were nice. I wish I was able to answer them all. Unfortunately, I don't. But no, those were definitely some great questions. Yeah.
Thank you, Saurabh, for really amazing session. And if you guys have any questions, simply bug him in the Twitter, because as far as Saurabh is very fast, right, when to responding on Twitter, because I can feel that, because whenever I try to reach out to him, I got an immediate response. I thought, oh my god, I got the response. So I cannot see any person who was as much as fast as you are, man. So
well, thanks. I live there now.
Same here. Like I used to live a lot over Twitter because that's the hub now, right? So thanks again. And yes, guys, I really would like to hear your feedback. Feel free to post over Twitter, and share your feedback, suggestion, and let us know how it went. And don't forget that we have one more session tomorrow at 11 a.m. where we're gonna have a lot of things to talk about, in terms of productivity and strategy. So don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you tomorrow. Till the time, stay safe, take care, and see you tomorrow.
Bye.